Have you ever looked at someone and thought you knew their story, just from the way they sat, or what they wore? What if you were wrong? It was a Tuesday morning, just after opening hours at the small town clinic. The waiting room was already half full, parents with tired eyes, a coughing man hunched over a clipboard, a child spinning slowly on a plastic chair. The television in the corner flickered with muted news. No one paid attention to the man who had walked in without checking in. He sat near the door, in the last seat of the row, as if he didn't intend to stay long. His coat was torn at the sleeve, and one of his shoes had no laces. In his lap rested a worn-out hat, the kind soldiers used to wear in another time. He didn't speak. He didn't look around. He just sat there, hands clasped, back curved forward like someone bracing against something deeper than cold. A nurse stepped out with a clipboard, glanced at him, then at the receptionist. A short nod passed between them. She hesitated for a second, just a second, then walked over. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make a scene. But her tone cut clean through the room. "Sir, I'm sorry, you can't wait here." The man didn't protest. He didn't even look up. He slowly picked up his hat, held it against his chest, and stood. Every movement was deliberate, like each one cost him something. As he turned toward the door, the waiting room turned back to its own silence. No one made a sound. Outside, the wind was picking up. He stepped through it like someone who had been sent away before. He left without looking back, but the room remembered him longer than it wanted to. Inside, the air settled again. A woman with a toddler shifted uncomfortably in her chair. A man in a flannel jacket scratched the back of his neck, staring at the floor. They didn't speak about what just happened. But the silence had changed. It had shape now. At the reception desk, the young assistant leaned toward the nurse and whispered, "He's the same one from last week, isn't he?" The nurse didn't answer. She just flipped through her clipboard, lips pressed thin. Outside the glass doors, he was still visible, just a figure sitting on the edge of the concrete planter, shoulders hunched, one hand holding that same beat-up hat on his lap. A little girl tugged on her mother's coat. "Why did he have to go?" she asked. The mother glanced toward the door and replied too quickly, "He's just not supposed to be here." That word, just. It carried more weight than they knew. To most of them, he was a fixture, like the old bench by the post office or the faded mural down by the train tracks. Always there, always alone. Some called him the vet. Others avoided calling him anything at all. They never saw where he slept. No one asked why he walked with a limp or why his right hand seemed slower than his left. No one noticed that he never asked for money. He only waited, outside clinics, grocery stores, bus stops, never breaking the rules, never raising his voice. The town had seen him for years. But seeing was not the same as knowing. And none of them knew a thing. The door shut behind him harder than anyone meant it to. It wasn't slammed. Just firm. A little too firm for a man who didn't resist. Outside, the wind had picked up. It pushed against his coat like it had something to prove. He pulled the collar tighter and sat down slowly on the stone ledge that lined the front walkway. His left leg moved stiffly, like it carried something the other didn't. He placed his old hat back on his lap, smoothing it with the back of his hand. Then he lowered his head, not in shame, but in habit. It was a posture he'd learned over time. One that kept people from looking too long, or worse, looking too closely. People passed. A few glanced. None stopped. Inside, someone muttered, "At least he didn't make a scene." A man in a baseball cap, waiting near the door, spoke without turning. He didn't have to. That's what makes it worse. The nurse who'd asked him to leave stood in the hallway, arms folded, eyes fixed on the glass. He's been coming every week, she said softly. Doesn't ask for anything. Just sits there until someone tells him to go. The receptionist answered without looking up. It makes people uncomfortable. Outside, the man still hadn't moved. He was watching the sky now, squinting against the light, like trying to measure something in it. There was no anger in his eyes. No accusation. Just the stillness of someone who had stood in worse places, and had no energy left to explain that to anyone. Across the street, a boy on a bicycle stopped at the corner, watching him. The boy didn't move for a long time. He just stayed there, straddling his bike, one foot on the curb, looking like he wanted to ask something but didn't know where to start. The man shifted slightly, wincing. His hand moved to his side, to the place that had been hurting since the night before. Still, he stayed seated, breathing slow. No one called for help. No one stepped out. The door had closed, and for everyone inside, the day continued. But for the man outside, the cold was no longer the worst part. The sound of tires on gravel was nothing out of the ordinary. Cars came and went all day. But this one was different. Slow. Heavy. Intentional. A black SUV, clean and without markings, pulled into the small lot outside the clinic. The windows were dark, the kind you couldn't see through unless you were meant to. It stopped, engine still running, as if it hadn't planned to stay long. Inside the waiting room, conversation had returned in quiet murmurs. The woman with the toddler was scrolling through her phone. The man in the flannel jacket had gone back to coughing into his sleeve. No one noticed the door open again, at least not at first. But the nurse at the front desk did. Her eyes flicked up, then widened, just slightly. She stood straighter. A man stepped inside. Tall. Upright. His uniform wasn't flashy, but it didn't need to be. The pressed creases, the perfect collar, the 4 stars on his shoulders said more than any introduction could. His shoes didn't make a sound on the tile. It was his presence that spoke. He scanned the room once, calmly. His expression was unreadable. Not cold, not warm, measured. Like someone used to walking into rooms where every detail mattered. The receptionist opened her mouth, then closed it again. He didn't acknowledge anyone. Didn't give a name. He simply turned toward the glass door, where the homeless man was still sitting, hands clasped, eyes closed against the morning light. For a moment, the general didn't move. Then, without a word, he stepped outside. The nurse followed him with her eyes, but she didn't move. No one did. Out on the sidewalk, the man in the coat didn't notice at first. Or maybe he did, and just didn't react. He kept his head bowed, like he was trying to stay beneath the world. The general walked up to him, not fast, not slow. He stopped a few feet away. Then he did something no one expected. He raised his right hand in a full, formal salute. It wasn't casual. It wasn't polite. It was the kind of salute given to someone who had earned it the hard way. The kind given by one soldier to another, equal to equal. The man on the sidewalk looked up. At first, there was no recognition. Just confusion. Then his eyes softened. He stood, slowly, painfully, and returned the gesture, not quite as steady, but no less real. Inside the clinic, every conversation had stopped. The woman with the child had tears in her eyes, though she didn't know why. The man in the flannel had his hand over his mouth. No one said a word. They just watched. The general lowered his hand, nodded once, and said quietly, "It's been a long time." The other man didn't speak. He just gave a half smile, one corner of his mouth rising, as if something long buried had finally stirred. And for the first time that morning, someone opened the clinic door, not to send the man away, but to invite him back in. But neither of them moved. They just stood there, in a silence that carried more than words ever could. People inside the clinic didn't know what to do with what they had just seen. It wasn't every day a four-star general saluted a homeless man outside a small-town medical office. It wasn't in their frame of reference. It wasn't in any of the stories they told about men like him. The receptionist stood frozen, halfway through typing someone's insurance number. The nurse had moved to the window without realizing it, her hand resting on the glass as if she needed to feel the moment was real. The boy on the bike hadn't left. He was still watching from across the street, now holding onto the handlebars with both hands, feet flat on the pavement. The man in the coat lowered his hands slowly, with the stiffness of someone who had done it before but hadn't in a long time. He didn't speak. Neither did the general. They just stood there, two men in uniforms that no longer matched, one polished, one buried beneath wear and years. A woman sitting near the door leaned toward her husband. "Who is he?" she whispered. He didn't answer. His eyes were still fixed on the sidewalk. Finally, the general spoke. Not loud, not for show. Just enough to carry. "You saved lives," he said. "You saved mine." There was no ceremony in the words. No audience required. Just truth laid bare in the open air. The man in the coat looked away, toward the sky. Then back to the general. His voice was rough, barely audible. "I did what I had to." The general nodded once. No more words. He didn't try to explain anything to the others. He didn't turn and face the crowd inside. He wasn't there for them. The man sat down again, slower this time, his body showing the toll of years no one had asked about. The general remained standing, hands behind his back now, like he was still in formation. But his eyes had softened. Back inside, something shifted. The atmosphere that had once felt indifferent now carried weight. The silence was no longer empty, it was reverent. Someone opened the door. No one was sure who moved first, but a nurse walked out with a cup of water in her hand. She offered it without saying anything. The man accepted it without looking up. A minute passed. Then two. The general stepped aside, gave one last nod, and without a word, turned and walked back toward his SUV. His steps were steady. No urgency. He didn't look back. As the vehicle pulled away, someone inside finally spoke. "I think we just saw something important," the man in the flannel jacket said quietly. His wife took his hand and held it tighter than usual. Outside, the man sipped the water slowly. Not because he was thirsty, but because he wasn't sure what came next. For the first time in a long time, the world had paused. Not to pity him. Not to push him away. But to witness him. And for the people watching through the glass, that single salute would stay with them longer than they could explain. His name was Thomas Avery. That much, the clinic staff would learn later, though most had only ever known him as the man who sat outside on Tuesdays, quiet and unmoving. No one asked where he came from. No one asked why he kept to himself, or why he never asked for anything, even when he clearly needed help. Thomas never offered a story, and people never stayed long enough to wonder if there was one. But now, the general had left, and something was different. A few patients had stepped outside, pretending to make phone calls, lingering near the bench where Thomas still sat. He kept his eyes low, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve, hiding the shaking in his fingers. A nurse returned with a folded blanket and a paper cup of tea. She placed them beside him without speaking. Thomas looked at the tea for a long time before finally taking a sip. A man in a gray coat, who'd been sitting inside earlier, walked up and cleared his throat. "My father was Army," he said. "Retired out of Fort Bragg." Thomas looked up, not startled, just watchful. The man continued. He would have said that salute meant something more than words. Thomas nodded once. Then, after a pause, he said softly, "That man, he was a lieutenant once. Green. Too green. We were pinned for 6 hours. I pulled him out. Didn't think he even remembered." The man took a step closer. "He remembered." Thomas gave a faint smile. "Maybe. But I didn't do it for a medal. Didn't do it for this." He motioned, vaguely, toward the clinic doors, the gathering people, the sudden attention. "I did it because he was mine to protect. That's what we did." His voice was steady, but low. Not bitter. Not proud. Just a man stating facts. The man in the gray coat nodded respectfully and stepped away. He didn't ask anything more. Thomas looked down at his hands, calloused and lined. They had done things that couldn't be seen in any record. They had carried pain without ever raising a flag for it. He never told his story because he didn't think it was a story. To him, it was just life. Just one long, quiet service. And that was enough. When Thomas Avery finally stood up from the bench, the movement was slow but certain. The paper cup still in his hand, now half empty, warm from his grip. He glanced once more down the street where the general's SUV had disappeared, then turned toward the clinic. This time, the door opened before he reached it. The same nurse who had once asked him to leave now stood aside, holding the door open. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes said everything. Inside, the waiting room had shifted. No longer tense, no longer avoiding. People looked up as he entered, this time not with suspicion, but with something quieter. Something closer to reverence. A young boy, maybe 10 or 11, stood and walked toward him with a packet of crackers. He hesitated, then held them out. "These are for you," he said. Thomas took them gently. "Thank you, son," he replied, his voice dry but kind. The boy's mother gave a small nod from behind him. It was tight, hesitant, but real. No one rushed him. No one asked questions. The receptionist, who once avoided eye contact, now looked directly at him. "We can get you checked in, Mr. Avery," she said softly. He raised an eyebrow, the faintest flicker of surprise in his expression. "That's kind of you." She gestured toward a chair near the wall. "You can wait right here." Thomas didn't argue. He simply sat, folding the blanket over his lap. His hands rested on top, calm and still. Around him, the room went back to its rhythm, voices low, footsteps soft, a cough here or there. But it was different now. He wasn't outside anymore. He wasn't invisible. He was seen. Not for the scars. Not for the silence. But for something deeper, something that didn't require medals or headlines. Just presence. Just quiet strength. And in that room, people began to understand that dignity doesn't always walk in with polished boots. Sometimes, it arrives slowly, in worn shoes and folded hands. Thomas sat quietly, a calm stillness settling around him like an old coat. The blanket across his lap had slipped a little, but he didn't adjust it. He just let it rest there, like the moment didn't need to be fixed. Around him, the clinic moved in soft waves. A nurse passed by, nodding without a word. The receptionist answered a call in a hushed tone. People came and went, but every so often, a glance would drift back toward him, not out of curiosity now, but out of respect. The boy with the crackers had returned to his seat, sitting a little taller than before. He kept looking at Thomas, not in awe, but in quiet wonder. Like he was trying to understand something that didn't come from textbooks. Thomas leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes for a moment. Not to sleep. Just to feel what it was like to be inside and still. To be in a room full of people and not have to disappear. No one asked for more of his story. No one pressed him for details. And he didn't offer any. But the weight of what had happened lingered in the room. A salute outside the clinic had changed something, not just in how others saw Thomas, but in how they saw themselves. Later that day, after his name had been quietly added to the patient list, and someone had taken his blood pressure, Thomas stood to leave. As he reached the door, the nurse who had once turned him away met his eyes. "We'll see you next Tuesday, Mr. Avery?" she asked gently. Thomas paused, then gave a small nod. "If I'm still around." "You will be," she replied, with a certainty that surprised even her. He pushed the door open and stepped back into the late morning sun. The cold had softened. The wind had calmed. His steps were still slow, but there was something lighter in them now. The general never returned that day. He didn't need to. Because the salute had already done its job. And for Thomas Avery, it was the first time in years he walked away not as a man surviving, but as a man remembered. Sometimes, the most powerful recognition comes not from headlines or medals, but from a single, silent gesture, a salute. Thomas Avery didn't ask to be seen. He never told his story or demanded respect. Yet, when a four-star general raised his hand to honor him, the entire room paused. In that moment, dignity returned, not just to one man, but to everyone watching. Because it reminded them that we often walk past quiet heroes every day, never knowing what battles they've carried in silence. The weight of a salute isn't in the motion, it's in what it acknowledges: sacrifice, service, and the humanity we too easily overlook. So ask yourself, who in your life deserves a silent salute? Someone you've passed by? Someone you've judged too quickly? Maybe it's time we looked again. If this story moved you, or made you think of someone you haven't seen the same way since, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Legacy of Courage Stories. Because these quiet moments, they matter. And together, we can make sure they're never forgotten.